Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 112 Introduction to Criminology. My name is Tony Farrar, and I am, of course, your instructor for this semester. Tonight's lecture is going to cover Chapter 2, where we're going to take a look at the nature and extent of crime. And with that, we're going to look at a couple of different things. First of all, we're going to look at some different forms of crime data, meaning where are those sources of crime data? Where do they come from? And you'll see that there are several different things that we'll take a look at on where we get this type of data. We're going to take a look at some recent trends in crime rates. And although the textbook is a little bit dated on the crime rates, it'll still give you an idea of how crime might be perceived. You kind of ask yourself the question, do you believe crime is up or down? And depending upon your answer, why? We're next going to list some of the factors or take a look at some of those things that might influence crime rates. We're going to go a little deeper and identify some of the gender and racial patterns in crime. Then finally, we're going to clarify the term aging out, and it's important to know what that term means and how it fits into criminology itself. And then we'll end up tonight's lecture taking a look at the concept of chronic offending and what does that mean, and also taking a look at maybe some of the causes on why people might offend. Before we get into all that, though, let's look at our lecture night fact or fiction. So fact or fiction, crime is out of control and is more dangerous now in the United States than at any time in our history. So think about that question as we go through tonight's lecture. So a little case study. So MS-13 is a violent international criminal organization based out of El Salvador and Honduras, but with thousands of members across the United States. Now, with numerous branches, or what we kind of call cliques, MS-13 is the largest and perhaps the most violent street gang in the U.S., and specifically when we're talking about this case study in Long Island. Now, and here's a couple of photographs that you can kind of look at when you can see the amount of activity that this particular group is involved in. So in 2016, an individual by the name of Arnoliv Vasquez, and his nickname was Momia or Lito is his name, a member of the Brentwood Locos, which is a clique of the BLS, pled guilty to his involvement in a December 18th, 2011 execution-style murder of two brothers. Now, a couple things, we want to figure out and that kind of come to mind as we look at this little case study. First of all, why did it take so long before we were actually able to prosecute this individual? So kind of moving on, though. Now, after committing the murders, Vasquez fled to El Salvador and then returned to a small Georgia town where on May 19th, 2015, he was arrested and then transferred to the Eastern District of New York, where the actual murders had taken place. And, we ask ourselves some questions in here again. What motivated the murders? Well, it turns out that members of the BLS clique agreed that Enston Ceron must be killed because he was not attending some of the meetings, or, for a lack of better words, putting in work, meaning doing things for the gang. And the gang also feared that Ceron might cooperate with police if he was arrested. So with all of that together, they determined that they needed to murder Saran, who belonged to another MS-13 clique. And fearing that he might retaliate when he learned the BLS killed his brother. So, I mean, while it's confusing, you can see that there's all these different things going on. Now, on December 18th, 2011, Velasquez and Serna, whose name was Taz, armed with semi-automatic handguns, asked Enston and Ricardo for a ride home from a party. And when the car stopped in a quiet neighborhood, Velasquez and Serna executed the two brothers, meaning that they basically killed them. And when another vehicle approached the murder scene, Serna also fired multiple shots at that driver, striking him once in the chest, but that driver actually survived. So, when you look at these types of crimes, and it goes on, the case study talks about at the sentencing hearing, while acknowledging the role Velasquez played in the double homicide, his attorney asked the judge to consider that his client was only 18 at the time of the crime, and during the intervening years had turned his life around. But, this whole thing kind of makes you think like, you've got gang members killing other gang members because you think that they're not going to be loyal to the gang and they're going to go out and either talk to the police or not put in work, etc. So, it all kind of comes down to a few questions. Why did this crime occur? And do crimes like this make you think that crime is really out of control? And much of what the public tends to know about crime tends to come from the media, which a lot of times may over-dramatize or even distort some of the true extent and seriousness of the issue. There's a phrase in the media that talks about if it bleeds, it needs, which kind of means that these higher profile cases, the more gore kind of sells. So news stories such as the Saran murders kind of, they strike fear in the general public, and they do convince people that crime is a bit out of control. And are Americans really justified in their fear of violent crime? Should they barricade themselves behind armed guards? And are crime rates actually rising or falling? Is there more crime today than ever before? And where do most crimes occur, and who commits all these types of crimes? Well, to answer these and some of those similar questions, criminologists have kind of put together or devised some different methods of crime data collection and analysis to formulate theories that explain the onset of crime, or to devise social policies that facilitate its control or elimination. So accurate data collection is extremely critical in assessing the nature and the extent of crime, which, remember, that's part of what criminologists do, tracking changes in the crime rate, and even measuring the individual and social factors that might influence criminality. So our discussion today, this chapter, we're going to look at how data is collected on criminal offenders and offenses, and what this type of information tells us about crime patterns and trends. And we're going to examine the concept of criminal careers and discover what available crime data can tell us about the onset, the beginning, continuation, and termination, or the end, of criminality. So we're going to start the discussion with an important source, or looking at those sources of crime data that criminologists will use to measure the nature and the extent of crime. Now, I put in a link to this video, and you don't have to watch it, but it's kind of an interesting perception video about whether crime is up or down. It's a newscaster goes around and basically ask the question. So kind of an interesting thing. But let me show you this before we get into our primary sources of data. And this is one of the sources. But every year, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, which is the clearinghouse for crime data in the United States, and we'll talk about that more, they publish these things called crime clocks. And as you can see, this is from the year 2017, and typically they run a little bit behind, but it tells you throughout the United States, on the average, how often a particular type of violent crime or property crime occurs. Now, I'm not trying to like freak you out or anything like that, but when you look at these slides or these numbers, let's look at violent crime, one murder every 30.5 minutes across the US. One rape every 3.9 minutes, one robbery every 1.7 minutes, one aggravated assault every 39 seconds. That should kind of make you think. Now, again, we asked some questions on whether we believe crime is up or down, but I wanted to show you this kind of interesting thing because it does make you really think. It's not just your city crime stats, it's stuff that we're looking at globally across the United States as a whole. So, what are some of those primary sources of data that criminologists will use? Well, the primary source of crime data are really considered surveys and official records. So in order to understand more about the nature and extent of crime, criminologists will use the records of government agencies such as police departments, prisons, and courts. And the Federal Bureau of Investigation collects most of the important crime data from local law enforcement agencies and publishes it in what is known as the Uniform Crime Report, or the UCR report. So the UCR includes crimes reported to all local law enforcement departments and the number of arrests by police agencies, again, per year. So criminologists will use these techniques, again, to measure the nature and extent of criminal behavior, the personality, attitudes, and backgrounds of criminal offenders. And understanding how such data is collected provides insight into how professional criminologists approach various problems and questions that come up in their field. Now, again, kind of in summary, in order to understand the nature and extent of crime, criminologists are going to use the records of government agencies like police departments, prisons, and courts. And as I just said, the FBI collects all of this data, or some of this data, and publishes it in a yearly publication called the Uniform Crime Report, and it's UCR for short. And the UCR, again, includes crimes reported by local law enforcement, to include the number of arrests that have been made. And the FBI receives and compiles records from about 17,000 departments serving the United States. So that's a lot of information. And the FBI also tallies and annually publishes the number of reported offenses by city, county, standard metropolitan statistical data, and even geographical divisions of the United States for most serious crimes. And these crimes that are typically collected in the UCR are what we call Part 1 crimes. And Part 1 crimes are kind of the higher level violent crimes and property crimes. So Part 1 crimes are going to include things like, if you look up to the left of the chart here, what we call person crimes would be murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. And then on the property side would be burglary, larceny, vehicle theft, and arson. Now, if you're trying to kind of wrap your head around really how do they do that, I have a chart from the Rialto Police Department where I used to work, And you can see, because we do use statistical data to see if we're doing better or is crime going up or down or what have you. And if you look, at the different color schemes, red is 2012, blue is 2013, and yellow is 2014. And here would be our UCR submissions to the FBI. And you can see that some of these categories went down, and you can see how they are, for each particular year. So if you look at the yellow, it looks like some of these crimes are actually dropping, and that does help us try to figure things out. So that's kind of a look at, again, Part 1 offenses that are reported annually to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice. And if you want more information and you want to find maybe your own city, you can go to the FBI's UCR reporting database, which is this link that I put in the presentation or tonight's lecture, so you can go there. Okay, so let's kind of get back on track. Now, in addition to recording crimes reported to the police, the UCR also collects data on the number of characteristics, age, race, and gender of individuals who have been arrested for committing a crime. Now, think about that. It's probably important to know, who are committing these crimes, and are they younger people or older people or this gender or this race, etc. And that's good information for criminologists. So, it does, the UCR doesn't just collect the number of crimes reported. It does go a little bit deeper. Okay. Included in the arrest data are both people who have committed Part 1 crimes and people who have been arrested for all other crimes, known collectively as what we call Part 2 crimes. And this latter group includes such crimes as, say, sex crimes and drug trafficking and vandalism, etc. So, again, a lot of data for us to kind of look at. Well, how does it get compiled? How does the FBI get that data? So the methods used to compile the UCR report, they are a little bit complex. Now, each month, law enforcement reports the number of these Part 1 crimes reported by victims, by officers who discovered crimes, or by other sources. And whenever criminal complaints are found through investigation to be unfounded or false, they're taken out of that actual count. So what we're trying to say here is that even though people might report a crime as this type of crime, if it's turned out to be unfounded before the report is published or the data is sent to the FBI, somebody will go back in and remove that item. However, the number of actual offenses known is reported to the FBI whether or not anyone is arrested for the crime, the stolen property is recovered, or prosecution ensues. And the UCR uses 3 different methods to express crime data. First, the number of crimes reported to police and arrests made are expressed in raw figures. Second, year-over-year percentage changes in the number of crimes are computed. And then finally, the crime rate per 100,000 people is calculated. So you could actually do a mathematical equation on that. And we won't do that, but I thought that'd be important for you to know. So, but what about crimes that are cleared? In addition, each month, law enforcement agencies also report how many crimes are cleared. And cleared crimes are basically cleared in 2 different ways. One, when at least one person is arrested, charged, and turned over to the court for prosecution, or 2, by exceptional means, which basically is when some element beyond police control precludes the physical arrest of an offender. So maybe we know who the person is, but they left the country and we can't get them back into the country. That could be a clearance type item, if that makes any sense to you. So Traditionally, though, as we look a little bit further into clearance rates, about half of all violent crime, so about 50%, if you will, and about 20% of property crimes are cleared by arrest each year. Not surprisingly, though, the most serious crimes, such as murder and rape, are cleared at a much higher rate than less serious property crimes, let's say, like theft. And when we think about that, and you can look at the chart right here of percentage of crimes cleared by arrest or exceptional means, and this is pretty recent data back in 2016, ask yourself what factors account for the difference in clearance rate. Why are the higher type crimes, the more serious ones, cleared, and some of the less serious ones not cleared? And what might be some reasons for that? And as you kind of think about that, I'll give you a couple. First of all, the media gives more attention to serious violent crimes. And as a result, local and state police departments are more likely to spend more time and resources conducting those types of investigations. There is more likely to be a prior association between victims of violent or serious crime and their attackers, and that fact can aid in police investigations. And even if they did not know one another beforehand, violent crime victims and offenders interact so that identifications can be facilitated a lot of times. And then finally, a lot of the serious violent crimes often produce physical evidence, things like blood and body fluids and fingerprints, that can be used to identify suspects. So those serious crimes, you've got a little bit more to work with. And I know that probably doesn't sound good, but these are some of the reasons for that. So kind of moving back to the UCR now, we know what is reported to the UCR, but what about the validity of it? Meaning, like, what about its accuracy? So despite criminologists' continued reliance on the UCR, and they use it a lot, sometimes its accuracy has been called into question. Now, the three main areas of concern are reporting practices of the law enforcement agencies, law enforcement practices, meaning are they recording all of the data, and the methodological problems that come along with some of that type of data gathering. So these are kind of the three main concerns, if you will. And again, fewer than half of all violent crimes and only 1/3 of property crimes are reported to the police. So you got to think about that too. So why would people not report? And the picture that you see in the right-hand corner there is kind of the iceberg theory. And we'll use this as an object lesson, if you will. So what we see above the water would be the crimes that we know that have happened, those that have been reported. Someone has reported that to the police. Well, what about the ones that haven't been reported? Are there a lot? Is there stuff under the water that we don't know about? So we have to kind of ask ourselves, what are some reasons that people may not report? Well, some of those reasons would be that confidence in law enforcement. Some victims really don't trust the police or have confidence in their ability to solve their problem. In cities in which people believe the police can help them are more likely to report crime. So if you have a better relationship, maybe insurance, victims without property insurance believe it's useless to report the theft because why do it? They already have insurance. Reprisal. Some victims fail to report because they fear reprisal from an offender's friend or family, etc. And in the case of family violence, maybe even from their spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend or something like that. It's not important enough. The more serious the crime, the greater the loss, and the more likely the citizen might report the crime. Some victims, however, believe that the incident was kind of a private matter and that really nothing should be done, or that the victimization or whatever was stolen or whatever it's not important enough, so they just don't do it. Dirty hands, which means that people who are themselves involved in criminal activities and have dirty hands, if you will, are less likely to report crime than those whose hands are clean, if you will. And then finally, social support. Non-reporters receive little social support from family, friends, and government institutions, and crime involving strangers are more likely to be reported than those involving friends or relatives. So these are just a couple of ways or a couple of reasons that perhaps some things are not reported. Okay, so what's another source? So I mean, the UCR took up a little bit of time, but it is important that we get through it. So another source would be what we call the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or NIBRS for short, and every one of these things has an acronym. So when we think about the UCR, we think that really there must be a more reliable source for crime statistics other than the UCR. So beginning in 1982, a 5-year redesign effort was undertaken to provide more comprehensive and detailed crime statistics. And the effort resulted in what we know now as the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or NIBRS, a program that collects data on each reported crime incident. So it is an improvement over the UCR. It records arrest information on 46 specific offenses and then 11 lesser offenses. And it also brings in some information on the incident, the victim, and the offender. So you're getting a little bit more information. NIBRS, again, also provides information on some issues that are facing police, including terrorism, white-collar crime, assaults on officers, offenses with weapons, narcotics offenses, hate crimes, domestic abuse, juvenile and gang crime, pornography, and even DUI, which is drunk driving or intoxicated while driving. The issue here is that only 6,250 law enforcement agencies submit data. So that really is only about 35% of all law enforcement agencies that participate, as compared to the UCR program, which is mandatory. So not everybody participates in this particular data set. Another source would be survey research. So another important method of collecting crime data is through surveys, in which people are asked about their attitudes and beliefs and values and characteristics, as well as their experiences with crime and victimization. Now, typically these are kind of geared towards youth. There's a lot of surveys that are done on high school campuses and even middle school campuses and college campuses as well. And surveys like this typically involve sampling, which is the process of selecting for a study a limited number of people who are representative of an entire group that has similar characteristics to whatever that population is. Does that, and hopefully that kind of makes sense. Now, to understand the social forces that produce crime, a criminologist might interview a sample of, let's say, 3,000 prison inmates drawn from the population of more than 2 million inmates in the United States. And in this case, the sample would represent the entire population of U.S. inmates. Does that make sense to everybody? And it is assumed that the characteristics of people or events in a carefully selected sample will be similar to those in that population at large. So if the sampling then is done correctly, the responses of those 3,000, that select group, would again represent those of the entire population of inmates. And that just kind of makes us ask the question, is that really enough? So that's survey research. Another form again, of a primary source of data would be the National Crime Victimization Survey. So we talked about survey research, but here's an actual example of a survey. Now, because victims do not report their experiences to the police, they report the crime. The UCR cannot measure all the annual criminal activity. To address the non-reporting issue, because we know people don't report, remember we went over some reasons why, the federal government sponsors the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS, another acronym, a comprehensive nationwide survey of victimization in the United States conducted annually by the U.S. Census Bureau for the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So again, another form of just information. So what about, again, when we kind of go back to self-reported surveys? Actually, this is another source. So we have surveys, we have the National Crime Victimization Survey. What about self-reported surveys? Another tool that is sometimes used by criminologists to measure crime is what we call the self-reporting survey. That asks people to describe in detail their recent and lifetime participation in criminal activities. So self-reports are given in groups, and the respondents, meaning those people that have the surveys and that are going to respond to them, are promised anonymity, meaning we'll keep their names confidential, in order to ensure the validity and honesty of their responses. Now, most self-report studies, again, have focused on juvenile delinquency and youth crime, etc. However, self-reports can also be used to examine the offense histories, let's say, of prison inmates or drug users or other segments of that criminal population. Now, you have to kind of ask yourself what would be the validity of self-reports. Well, critics of self-report studies frequently suggest that expecting people to candidly admit that they've been involved in illegal activity might be unreasonable. And this is especially true of those that have official records, the very people who may be engaging in the most criminal conduct. At the same time, some people may also exaggerate their criminal acts, forget some of them, or be confused really about what is being asked as a whole. So again, the validity of these self-reports really focuses in on the honesty of the self-reporting participants. And here's kind of an example of a survey that was given to high school seniors. And think about it, if you were a high school senior and you got this survey, would you answer some of these questions, even though your information is supposed to be kept confidential? So what about, now that we know some of the sources of crime data, what about the evaluation of the crime data? And we know that each source of crime data has strengths and weaknesses. So we're not going to go into real big detail here. If you're looking in your textbook or you're following along, if you look on page 39, it talks about collection data methods and some of the good and the bad. So the strengths of some of these, well, the UCR is offender data and collecting data on particular crimes that surveys really can't measure. And as far as the NCVS, it picks up things like unreported crimes and information on personal characteristics of victims, stuff, and these are things that the UCR really doesn't capture. And then finally, the self-reported surveys, this picks up things like personal characteristics of offenders. So these are some of the strengths when we evaluate some of the data. Well, if we're going to look at strengths, we need to look a little bit at some of the weaknesses. The UCR does not include unreported crimes. So it's whatever you report is what it is. And it is subject to reporting practices of police departments. So if the department itself tweaks or changes a reporting practice, that crime could either go up or down depending upon how they change it. Really quick example. Let's say that right now they take every auto burglary report, no matter what the loss is. Well, what if the department changed their reporting policy and said that we'll only take the report if there's over $2,000 worth of theft or damage? That means you're going to miss out on some of those crimes. Does that make sense to everybody? So again, subject to reporting practices of police departments. The NCVS estimates from limited samples of population, so they're not getting info from everybody. It's a limited group. It's based on personal recollections of those individuals, and it doesn't include things like homicide or drug abuse crimes. And then self-reported surveys, we kind of hit on this already, it really does rely on the honesty of the offenders. I threw in a chart just like I have in some of the other lectures so you can look at the different data collection methods right here, and it'll tell you some of the strengths and the weaknesses. So hopefully that is helpful to you. So with that being said, let's start to move into some trends in policing as far as crime goes. And we're not going to go through every single thing, but we'll go through a little bit. So after a decade of increase, crime rates peaked in, let's say 1991. And when the UCR recorded, from at that time, the UCR recorded almost 15 million crimes in a single year. Now, since then, the number of crimes has been in decline. About 9.2 million total crimes were reported in 2015. And that's a drop of about 6 million since the 1991 peak, despite a boost, and you have to consider this, of more than 50 million people in the general population. Now, on your slide that you're looking at, I have violent crimes and thefts have declined, and I put violent crime in red because in some cities currently, we're not talking the textbook 2015 or 2016, we're talking 2019 right now, okay? Some cities, violent crime has increased. So I don't want you to think in every city across the nation, violent crime has gone down. In some places, it has gone up. But typically, generally from 1991, as we travel through time, crime has really been at a reduction. Now, there's also been a significant drop in UCR violent crimes like murder, rape, robbery, and assault, a trend that began in 1991. About 1.2 million violent crimes are now being reported to the police each year, a rate of about 372 per 1,000 Americans. And there are 800,000 fewer violent crimes being reported today than in 1991, when almost 2 million incidents occurred yearly, a violence rate of 758 per 100,000 people. So this means that the violence rate has dropped almost 50% from its peak because the number of violent crimes is far lower and the general population continues to increase. So kind of keep that in mind. The property crimes reported in the UCR include things like larceny, motor vehicle theft, arson, burglary, etc. Property crime rates have also declined in recent years, dropping more than 10% during the past decade. At its peak in 1991, about 13 million property crimes were reported at a rate of almost 5,000 per 100,000 citizens. Currently, about 8 million property crimes are reported annually to police, a rate of about 2,500 per 100,000. So it's gone down quite a bit. According to the latest NCVS survey, U.S. residents aged 12 or older experienced about 20 million violent and property victimizations. And that's a lot. Like the UCR data, NCVS data shows that criminal victimizations have also declined significantly during the past 30 years. And in your textbook, they actually have a chart that you could look at. In 1973, an estimated 44 million victimizations were recorded, far higher than today. Since 1993, the rate of victimization has declined about 80%. Especially striking has been the decline in the rate of serious violent crime against youth aged 12 to 17, which has declined more than 70% since 1994, falling from, let's say, 62 victimizations per 1,000 youth to fewer than 15 per 1,000 youth. Now, that doesn't mean in every city is going to follow this pattern, but it does show you in general, in a larger scope, that things are declining. So circle back to our fact or fiction question. It was, crime is out of control and is more dangerous now in the United States than any other time in history. Well, based on what we just talked about, we can really say that crime rates are lower now than they were 20 years ago. The violent crime rate, including murder, has been on a decline, and crime rates were much higher in the 19th century. So now that we kind of have answered some of those questions, let's look at maybe what the future holds. Predicting crime rates and kind of look at patterns, if you will, of crime. So increase in numbers of elementary school aged children may lead to future increases in crime as children reach teenage and young adult age. And along with that, the rising number of senior citizens could lead to a lower crime rate. With that being said, though, it is kind of risky to speculate about the future of crime trends because current conditions can change very rapidly. While crime rates have declined for more than 20 years, they did spike a little bit in 2015 when the murder rate jumped about 10%, and preliminary 2016 data indicates that that particular rate increase might continue. Now, again, only in some cities, okay? And it's also possible that crime rates may rise in the future because of, let's say, limited economic opportunities. Globalization and the outsourcing of manufacturing jobs may cause the current generation of teens to have difficulty finding jobs. And, there is, of course, no telling what changes are in store that may influence crime rates. Technological developments such as e-commerce on the internet have created new classes of crime that are not recorded by any of the typical traditional methods that we tend to do it right now. So as we start to, again, look at this thing, predicting future crime trends and things like that, we have to look at a couple of things. The Ferguson effect, which is on the law enforcement side, a kind of a theory, if you will, that because of all the use of force issues that are being brought forward in law enforcement, that perhaps law enforcement will be a little bit more hesitant to be involved in certain aspects of crime fighting, if you will, and therefore, because of that, maybe crime will go up because the officers aren't acting as they would have prior. We talked about limited economic opportunities. Drug usage with the legalization of certain drugs and the possibility of legalization of others. Will that impact future crime trends? And then think to yourself, what other things could actually impact crime? So now that we've kind of talked about the impact, let's finish up with with crime patterns and look at, why do these even matter, and is it important for criminologists? Well, criminologists look for stable crime rate patterns to gain insight into the nature of crime. The cause of crime may better be understood by examining the crime rate. So, I mean, and that's important to know. So, if criminal statistics consistently show that crime rates are higher in poor neighborhoods in large urban areas, the cause of crime may be related to poverty and neighborhood decline. Well, if in contrast, though, crime rates are spread evenly across society and rates are equal in poor and even, let's say, affluent neighborhoods, this would provide little evidence that crime has an economic basis. So see, some of these patterns are important. Instead, crime might be linked to socialization or personality or intelligence or some other trait unrelated to class, position, or income. So as we go further, let's examine some of the traits and some of the patterns that may influence the crime rates. So again, criminologists consider the explanation of crime trends one of their most important goals, yet when they're asked about it, has crime gone up or down, sometimes they really don't have a good answer because things do kind of ebb and flow, if you will. And there are many reasons to explain crime or crime rates. So, things like age structure and immigration and economy and jobs and abortion and gun availability, gang membership, drug use, all of these are things that we can look at. Even the media, medical technology, aggressive law enforcement, incarceration, cultural change, the internet can all help explain how crime patterns are developed and how crime can actually change. So, we talked a little bit about it before. Criminologists look for stable crime rate patterns to gain insight into the nature and cause of crime. And we talked about how if statistics show crime is higher in one neighborhood in a large urban area, then it might be caused by poverty or something similar. And there was a theory that was brought forward, and we won't spend too much time on it, but it was called the broken windows theory. And what this theory basically says is that if areas in the neighborhood are left to be run down, windows are broken and weeds are overrunning and windows are boarded up and a property is just kind of dilapidated, etc., then that shows that people kind of really don't care about the neighborhood, and therefore that not caring can bring forward or bring about more type of crime. There's also an interesting thing when you talk about crime patterns called ecology of crime. And there are truly distinct ecological and temporal patterns in crime rates. Metropolitan areas are more crime prone than rural areas, and that would probably make sense because typically there's more people. But what about like place, time, season, or climate? It's kind of an interesting thing. So again, there are distinct patterns in crime rates depending upon where you're at. Okay, so there are seasonal patterns. Crime rates are the highest during warm summer months of July and August. And why is that? Well, maybe because during the summer, teenagers who are usually, who typically have some high crime levels are out of school and they have a greater opportunity to commit crime. Maybe people spend more time outdoors during warm weather, making themselves easier targets. Maybe homes are left vacant or open during the summer, making them more vulnerable to things like that. Maybe people tend to imbibe in alcohol or some other type of intoxicant during the summertime, which might make them a little bit easier to anger or even become a victim. So, I mean, these are different things when you kind of think about that. So the day, the season, the climate, the temperature, weather, affects or may have impacts on violent crime, regional differences. Why are all these things a little bit different? Crime rates may also be higher on the first day of the month rather than any other time because the government welfare and social security checks arrive during this time. And with that comes an increase in activities such as breaking into mailboxes or robbery, etc. Also, people may have more disposable income at this particular time, and the availability of extra money may relate to behaviors associated with crime, which could be things like drinking, partying, gambling, etc. And some crimes are typically more likely to take place at night, while others are more common during the daytime. Others are time resistant, if you will, and take place at any hour of the day or night, and some are not. And again, while large urban areas have by far the highest violent crime rates, there are some exceptions to that pattern as well. So kind of interesting. So typically, though, the western and southern states have had consistently higher crime rates than the Midwest and the Northeast, and ask yourself why. And this pattern has convinced some criminologists that regional cultural values can influence crime rates. And others believe that regional differences can be explained by perhaps even economic differences. And that kind of brings us into another crime pattern, which would be co-offending. It is generally accepted that crime tends to be a group activity, and that adolescents in particular are overwhelmingly likely to commit crime in groups. We kind of know that. Co-offending is or has been seen to be more prevalent in neighborhoods that are less disadvantaged, more stable, and contain more people who can be trusted. Ironically, this kind of means that efforts to improve neighborhood stability and cohesiveness may also help produce an environment that could produce some type of co-offending. Well, what about gender? Well, male crime rates are higher than females. Sorry, guys. And the most recent UCR report, arrest statistics, indicate that males account for about 80% of all arrests for serious violent crimes, and males also account for more than 60% of the arrests for serious property crimes. So kind of begs the question, why is that? It could be some trait differences, emotional, physical, or psychological. It could be some socialization differences, that maybe women are socialized to be less aggressive. And I don't mean that demeaning, I mean it in a positive form. Cognitive differences. Women are typically better communicators. Sorry, guys. And then maybe some social and political differences, even down to the liberal feminist theory that really talks about, this is a view of crime that suggests that the social and economic role of women in society can help control the crime rate as well. So there are some different things that we can look at when it comes to crime patterns, gender, and crime. So, I mean, and by no means, and I'm showing you this picture of a female gang member that was arrested for armed robbery that had a really cool looking gun. So that doesn't mean that ladies don't commit crime. It just typically men tend to do a little bit more. So what about race now? When we talk about race and crime, well, there's no more complex and controversial issue than that of race and crime. And that is because the UCR arrest data indicates that minority members are involved in a disproportionate share of criminal activity. African Americans make up about 13% of the general population, yet they account for more than 40% of arrests for Part 1 violent crimes and about 25% of serious property crimes. So again, racial differences in the arrest rates can be attributed to different things. It could actually be an artifact of institutional bias found in the justice system. and not actual differences in criminal activity. So ask yourself this: are the police maybe more likely to stop, search, and arrest minorities? I included in here for you to look at, if you have time, a link to a video on stop and frisk, and a very controversial technique used by law enforcement. Take a look at it if you have time. You don't have to, but this section will make a little bit more sense. And then by definition, just so you know, racial profiling, this is in fact police initiated action directed at a suspect or group of suspects based solely on race. And while this isn't kind of a racial divide here, look at these two photos and tell me, would you really treat them the same? If you saw them both walking down the street together, would you already have some type of bias, whether it's implicit or not, built in to your brain on who might be the one involved in criminal activity? Well, what about guns? Now, this isn't the great debate, okay, but we're going to cover it quickly. Firearms play a dominant role in criminal activity. According to the NCVS, firearms are typically involved in more than 280,000 non-fatal victimizations each year. According to the UCR, about 70% of all murders involve firearms. Most of these weapons are handguns. And criminals of all races and ethnic backgrounds are equally likely to use guns in violent attacks. So it's the ongoing gun debate. Now, because of these findings, there's an ongoing debate here. And some criminologists staunchly favor gun control. In a classic work, Franklin Zimring and Gordon Hawkins believe that the proliferation, the amount of handguns, and the high rate of lethal violence they cause is in fact the single most significant factor separating the crime problem in the United States from that in the rest of the developed world. So kind of interesting, but in contrast, some criminologists, particularly a man by the name of Gary Kleck, believe that personal gun use can actually be a deterrent to crime, and that guns almost certainly save lives. Now, while guns are involved in murder, suicides, and accident, Kleck believes the benefit of guns as a crime prevention device should not be overlooked, and that at least 18 national surveys have consistently confirmed that defensive gun usage by potential victims is very common, probably more common than the criminal that uses a gun. So, while the gun control debate remains this, kind of a heated thing, evidence out of Chicago illustrates the difficulty of keeping guns out of the hands of criminals. And research by another person by the name of Philip Cook and his associates have found that while the vast majority of the city's homicides are committed with guns, most guns used in crime are quite old, with a median age of over 10 years, and have gone through a series of transactions before being actually acquired by the current owner. So, we talk about guns and crime, and even open carry, something we're not going to get into right now. And we talk about, here's some pictures of open carry. Is this okay with you? There are states that have passed legislative laws that allow you to open carry in public. And is this a good thing or is it not a good thing? So that's for you to decide. Okay, we're just about done. We're going to talk a little bit about social class and crime. Crime is often considered a lower class phenomenon. People living in inner city, high poverty areas are generally more likely to join gangs, sell drugs, and commit crimes than those residing in wealthy suburban areas. Neighborhoods experiencing income inequality, lack informal social controls, and resource deprivation have crime rates significantly higher than can provide economic opportunities to the residents. When these conditions exist, youth gangs flourish, resulting in higher rates of the most serious violent crimes, including murder and assault. So does it make sense that crime is usually a lower class phenomenon? If it does, why? And if it doesn't, why? Ask yourself that. Now, there's a couple of thoughts on crimes when we talk about social class and crime. Some individuals commit what they call instrumental crimes, and these are illegal acts whose goal is to provide goods and services that can't be obtained through legitimate means, meaning if you don't have a job and you have to feed your family, you may have to go do something about that in order to get those goods and services because you couldn't do it through a legal, legitimate means. Now, people living in poverty are also believed to engage in what we call expressive crimes, such as rape and assault. And this is a result of their frustration with what they believe to be an unfair and just society. And that's not always the only reason. I'm giving you some of the criminological forethought, if you will, on why this is kind of like this. Unemployment and crime. It stands to reason that crime should correlate with unemployment rates, peaking during tough economic times when people are out of work and money is tight. Now, with everything I've kind of said, not all criminologists accept the class crime association at face value. An alternative explanation is the relationship between crime and social class is a function of law enforcement practices, not actual criminal patterns. Police may devote more resources to poor areas, and consequently apprehension and arrest rates might be higher in those particular areas, giving a false picture of true class crime association. Does that make sense? And prosecutors may be more likely to file charges against the poor while handling cases involving the middle class informally, a practice which accounts for maybe the overrepresentation of the lower class in the prison population. And people in the middle and upper classes may commit white-collar crimes that are rarely detected or even enforced. So these are some other things to think about. When it comes to age and crime, there's kind of a general agreement that age is inversely related to crime. Criminologist Travis Hershey and Michael Gottfriedson state that age is everywhere correlated with crime. Its effects on crime do not depend on the demographic correlates of crime. So regardless of your economic status, marital status, race, sex, and other factors, younger people commit crime more often than older people. And this relationship has been kind of stable across time. Official statistics tell us that young people are arrested at a rate disproportionate to their numbers in the population. And victim surveys generate similar findings for crimes in which assailant age can be determined. And then finally, we talk about, the amount of crime by kids. As a general rule, the peak age for property crime for youngsters is about 16, and for violence is 18. And the age group 10 to 24 makes up about 20% of the population, but commits about 34% of serious violent crimes and 35% of all property crimes. And finally, as we get close here, criminologists also agree that people commit less crime as they age out. Okay, and it's called aging out of crime. And some criminologists believe that aging out is linked to biology, the levels of hormones and brain chemicals that kind of ebb and flow in your body. So, the dopamine and adrenaline and et cetera, and the neurotransmitters. During adolescence, dopamine is known to facilitate aggressive behavior and increases serotonin. Dopamine known to facilitate aggressive behavior increases and serotonin is reduced. But during adulthood, dopamine recedes while serotonin, known to limit offensive behavior, tends to increase. And that's really why the younger generation might commit more criminal activity than the olders. Okay, we're down to our last part here. We're going to talk about chronic offenders. Crime data shows that most offenders commit a single criminal act, upon arrest, discontinue their antisocial activity. Now, others commit a few less serious crimes. A small group of criminal offenders, however, account for the majority of all criminal offenses. And these persistent offenders are referred to as career criminals, or what we're going to call here chronic offenders. And again, by definition, the small group of persistent offenders who account for the majority of criminal offenses. And what causes this chronic type behavior? Well, early onset could be one of those things, meaning that the beginning of criminal activity starts at an early age. And some of the implications that come along with this concept, this chronic offender concept, we look at things like mandatory sentences, three-strike policies, truth in sentences, etc. But again, criminologists believe that chronic offenders tend to be at-risk youth who are exposed to a variety of personal and social problems and who begin their law breaking at an early age. And that's a phenomenon, a word, a term by itself that we call early onset. And research studies have also linked this chronic behavior to low intellectual development and also to parents being involved in drugs. So, with that being said, we're done. I know that was a lot of information, and I appreciate your patience. Also, don't forget, at the end of each one of the chapters are a list of key terms. They're also posted in Canvas, and there are also a list of a couple of critical thinking questions. It would be very beneficial for you to go through all of those so that you have a good understanding and you can fill in some of the information that we were not able to cover in this particular lecture. And with that being said, that will do it for this lecture on Chapter 2, and until next time.